Imagine the devastating power Sauron could have had at his disposal had he been able to ally himself with Smaug the dragon during the War of the Ring. Smaug was a creature of terrifying power, whose presence alone had devastated the dwarven kingdom of Erebor and spread terror among the human cities of Esgaroth and Dale. A being of pure destruction, a machine of fire and fury capable of annihilating entire armies with his flaming breath. But even with Smaug's power at his disposal, Sauron never used it in his final struggle against the free peoples of Middle-earth. Smaug's absence from the War of the Ring was not a coincidence or an oversight. It was due to a series of complex reasons ranging from the dragon's nature to Sauron's strategic situation at the time. Smaug, the fearsome dragon who dominated the Lonely Mountain and annihilated the kingdom of Erebor, was one of the most powerful and imposing creatures in Middle-earth. However, his nature was something that set him apart from other servants of darkness, such as the orcs, the Nazgul, and even Saruman. Smaug was fundamentally independent, arrogant, and completely dominated by greed. He answered to no masters and was not the sort of creature to take orders, least of all from someone like Sauron, however powerful the Dark Lord was. Smaug's independence was not just a matter of pride, but of a mindset deeply ingrained in dragons. Ancient creatures, born of the darkness and corruption of Morgoth, dragons were by nature destructive and chaotic beings, driven almost exclusively by their own interests. They saw themselves as subordinate to no one, and Smaug exemplified this perfectly. He saw himself as absolute lord, not only over his vast horde, but over the Lonely Mountain itself and the lands around it. To Smaug, the idea of allying himself with another being, even if the being was Sauron, was inconceivable, for he recognized no one as superior. Furthermore, Smaug was driven by an insatiable desire for possessions, especially for gold and jewels. He did not seek power in the sense that Sauron did. He had no interest in dominating kingdoms or subjugating peoples. For him, the accumulation of wealth and dominion over his territory were enough. The idea of abandoning his treasure and his position to serve as a weapon of Sauron in a war he did not consider his own was completely against his nature. Smaug already had what he wanted: priceless treasure and a sense of supremacy over those around him. This combination of greed and pride formed an almost insurmountable barrier to any attempt to recruit him to an outside cause. Sauron, being a strategist and master manipulator, probably understood this about Smaug. He knew that the dragon was not like the Nazgul, who had been corrupted and enslaved by the promise of power, nor like Saruman, who had been seduced by the idea of becoming a lord at Sauron's side. Smaug had no such vulnerability to the temptation of status or influence, for he already considered himself a lord. The dragon's own pride, combined with his chaotic nature, made him an unpredictable and dangerous creature to any attempt to control. Even if Sauron could communicate with Smaug, convincing the dragon to serve under his command would be a nearly impossible task. To Smaug, any alliance would be seen as a threat to his freedom and an invasion of his pride. He saw other beings, especially the lower vermin, as he called men and dwarves, as creatures to be despised or dominated, rather than as allies in a common cause. In the dragon's mind, he owed no loyalty to anyone, not to Sauron, not to Morgoth before him. This sense of autonomy and disregard for others made Smaug a singular and isolated force, governed only by his own desires and whims. Another aspect that reinforced Smaug's independence was the fact that he saw the world around him as something that existed to satisfy his needs. When he took Erebor and drove out the dwarves, it was not out of loyalty to a greater cause or a desire for territorial conquest. He acted out of the pure pleasure of possessing and accumulating. Smaug saw the treasure as an extension of his own power, and protecting it was his highest priority. Anything that jeopardized his collection of riches or threatened his dominion over the Lonely Mountain would be met with hostility, that Smaug's independent and selfish nature also made him a reckless creature. His pride blinded him to danger, and he believed himself to be invulnerable. This eventually led to his downfall, when he underestimated the inhabitants of Esgaroth and was defeated by Bard. His death was a testament to how vulnerable his arrogance and isolation made him. This isolation, however, was an essential part of who Smaug was. He preferred to be a solitary force of destruction rather than submit to the will of another. Thus, Smaug was not the kind of being that Sauron could simply command or use in his plans for domination. His independence, insatiable greed, and fierce pride made any attempt at alliance nearly impossible. Even if Smaug had still been alive at the time of the War of the Ring, he would likely have rejected any proposal for an alliance, as it would have meant giving up some of his autonomy. Something he valued above all else, that Smaug's absence from the War of the Ring was therefore not a mere oversight, but a natural consequence of his very nature. Smaug was a chaotic and untamable force, a being who preferred to hoard treasure and maintain his territory rather than engage in conflicts that offered no personal gain. Ultimately, Smaug's independent nature made him an uncontrollable creature, even for the Dark Lord. First, Smaug was in Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, a place isolated and beyond the immediate reach of Mordor. Although Sauron had agents in various parts of Middle-earth, sending messengers to Smaug and establishing an alliance would require time and resources, which Sauron could not afford to spend as he prepared for the confrontation with Gondor and the Free Peoples. Furthermore, Smaug was an extremely proud and independent creature. He would not see Sauron as an ally, but rather as a potential threat to his domain and treasure. Dragons are, by nature, selfish and chaotic beings, hardly subject to the will of others. Any attempt to control them would probably end in conflict between them, since Smaug would not accept orders or limitations on his freedom and power. Another crucial point is the risk involved. Smaug was uncontrollable and unpredictable, and Sauron understood that such a volatile creature could turn against him at a critical moment. Unlike orcs, trolls, or even the Nazgul, Smaug could not be manipulated or dominated by the power of the One Ring. His chaotic nature and his thirst for destruction represented more of a danger than a sure advantage, that if Sauron tried to ally himself with Smaug, he would also have to pay a high price. Smaug would do nothing without a significant reward, probably in gold or land. This went against Sauron's strategy, who preferred to subjugate his followers through fear, without offering compensation. Smaug's greed would be an additional complication, as the dragon would demand more riches or promises that Sauron would not wish to grant. In addition, Sauron had to deal with opposition from the peoples of the north, especially the dwarves and men who harbored a deep hatred for Smaug due to the destruction of the kingdom under the mountain. Allying with the common enemy of these peoples could further unite the forces of resistance in the north, something Sauron preferred to avoid. After the fall of Smaug, the north was relatively isolated from the conflicts with Mordor, which allowed Sauron to concentrate his forces against Gondor and Rohan. Ultimately, Smaug's death was the deciding factor. The dragon was killed before the height of the War of the Ring, eliminating the possibility of Sauron using it. Bilbo and the dwarves' journey resulted in the dragon's death at the hands of Bard the Bowman, leaving Sauron without this powerful weapon. Without Smaug, Sauron had to rely solely on the armies of Mordor, the Nazgul, and the forces he had managed to subdue or persuade over the years. Thus, Smaug's absence from the War of the Ring was no accident. A combination of geographical, psychological, and strategic factors, coupled with the death of the dragon, prevented this alliance. For the free peoples of Middle-earth, this was a blessing. Had Smaug survived and somehow allied himself with Sauron, the fate of Gondor, Rohan, and all of Middle-earth might have been much darker. Imagine a Middle-earth where Sauron, the Dark Lord, reach his ultimate power by forming an alliance with Smaug, the last and most terrifying fire dragon. This dark and unlikely pact would bring forth a scenario of unparalleled destruction, a world where fire and shadow would dominate Middle-earth and all its inhabitants. Sauron, already a formidable strategist and master manipulator, would now wield Smaug as a force of raw, chaotic destruction, a living storm of fire and fury that would obey his commands. With Smaug at his side, Sauron would no longer need to rely solely on his armies of orcs and trolls, which, though numerous, were limited by their brutality and lack of discipline. Orcs could be defeated, trolls could be brought down, but Smaug was a force of nature, a calamity that no mortal weapon could contain. The dragon could sweep across the skies of Middle-earth like an eagle of death, casting a terrible and deadly shadow over cities and fortresses, unleashing flames that would reduce any structure, however strong, to smoldering ash. Gondor, the last great bastion of men, would be the first target of this dark alliance. Minas Tirith, the White City with its majestic walls and towers that defied time itself, would see its walls melted under Smaug's fire. The people, who long believed their city would never fall, would look to the skies and see not just a dragon, but an omen of the end. Smoke would fill the corridors and plazas, and the suffocating heat of the flames would turn even the bravest warriors into trembling shadows of fear. When Smaug's flames descended upon the city, no place would be safe, not even the crypts of the kings. Future generations of Gondor, if any survived to remember, would speak of this night as the Day of Fire, when Minas Tirith fell not to the hands of orcs, but to the flames of a dragon under Sauron's command. But Gondor would be only the beginning. Rohan, the land of horse lords, would also suffer Smaug's wrath. The plains of Rohan, once green and fertile, would become ash, destroyed by the dragon's unrelenting fire. Edoras, the golden capital, famous for its rolling hills and the hall of Meduseld where kings sang songs of courage, would be reduced to smoldering ruins. Not even the valiant riders of Rohan, led by Theoden or Eomer, could resist. Their sharp spears would be useless against Smaug's scales, as hard as iron, and their brave steeds would flee in terror at the sound of the dragon's wings. The terror would be so great that, for generations, the survivors of this war would tell their descendants about the great flame that swept through their lands. A flame no man, no sword, could stop. The psychological impact of Smaug's presence would be overwhelming. In a war where hope and courage were the most precious weapons, the mere existence of a dragon in Sauron's service would lead many of the free peoples to surrender before they even took up arms. News would spread like wildfire. Sauron's dragon is coming. Villages, farms, and entire towns would panic. Men, women, and children would abandon their homes, fleeing to the mountains or remote forests, seeking a refuge where they might escape the dragon's flames. But even the forests would not be safe, for Smaug, with his keen eyes and predatory instincts, would hunt down any sign of resistance, reducing everything in his path to ashes. The situation would also become desperate for the elves and dwarves, the ancient races that had resisted the powers of Morgoth and the shadows of Sauron for millennia. Lothlorien, the golden realm of Galadriel, with its majestic trees and untouched beauty, would see its splendor destroyed in a storm of fire. Not even elven magic could withstand Smaug's destructive power. Galadriel herself, one of the mightiest of the Eldar, would have to use all her strength merely to protect a fraction of her land, while ancient trees and crystal-clear rivers would become smoke and ashes. In Rivendell, Elrond would watch the destruction approaching, knowing that even with all the knowledge and wisdom of the elves, he had no weapon powerful enough to defeat the dragon. The Misty Mountains, which separated the east and west of Middle-earth, would also fall under Sauron's dominion. Moria, The ancient kingdom of the dwarves would be consumed by fire. The halls of Khazad-dûm, which once echoed with the sound of hammers and the songs of Durin's sons, would now resound only with the roar of flames and the cries of the fallen. Not even the great dwarven warriors, with their axes and armor, could stand against such an unrelenting force. The history of the dwarves, already marked by tragedy, would gain yet another dark chapter, where even stone, the symbol of the resilience of all us children, would succumb to Smaug's fire. And then, in the darkness of the journey, Frodo and Sam, the ring-bearers, would be more helpless than ever. They, who carried the only hope of Middle-earth, would now be in the lands of Mordor, a realm that, with Smaug in its ranks, would become almost invincible. Sauron would know the ring was near, and with the dragon at his service, there would be nowhere for the hobbits to hide. Smaug would patrol the skies of Mordor like a bird of prey, searching for any trace of the One Ring. Frodo's secret mission would become a lost cause. A single sight of the dragon would shatter all hope. With Smaug on the lookout, no disguise or hobbit courage could prevent the ring from falling into Sauron's hands. The destruction brought by Smaug would have no limits. Sauron could use him to crush all alliances, to eradicate any symbol of resistance. The free peoples, without their kingdoms and leaders, would find themselves utterly conquered. The war that had once been a battle between light and dark would turn into a surrender, an absolute massacre. With Smaug as his ultimate weapon, Sauron would not even need to lead his forces personally. Mordor, with its dark plains and menacing tower, would stand as the heart of an empire of fire and shadows that would engulf all of Middle-earth. And so, a new world would be born, a world of eternal darkness, where the ruins of the realms of men, elves, and dwarves would stand as silent monuments to the victory of evil. Sauron, with the One Ring in his possession and Smaug at his side, would rule unopposed. The light of hope would be extinguished, and the age of men, elves, and dwarves would come to an end forever. The dragon, a symbol of destruction and pride, would be the last thing any living creature would see before Middle-earth became nothing more than a land of eternal shadows, ruled by Sauron's will.